Freedom, freedom, freedom over fame. Freedom over cycle stays the same.
Welcome. First of all, welcome. This is Unsolicited Perspectives, and I am your host, Bruce Anthony. Thank you for listening and watching wherever you get your podcasts and video podcasts. Subscribe, share, like, comment, and rate us. You can find us on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitch at unsolicited_perspectives. You can find us on Twitter and TikTok at unsolicited_PER. Watch us live. Now, watch us live every Thursday night, 7:30 p.m. Eastern on Twitch and YouTube. Our audience continues to grow with each and every episode, and I humbly thank you.
Welcome everybody to the season premiere episode of season 2. On today's episode, we'll be talking to Dr. Cameron J. Harris, a professor at George Mason University. And this will be the first part on our series on education in America. And I'll also be telling the story about the time that a college course made me cry. But first things first. So this series on education in America is important to me. A lot of people don't know this, but I actually went to college to be a high school history teacher. I wanted to be there for the kids and inspire them in teaching. And it was a couple of things that led me to this, right? Lean On Me, the principal, Joe Clark, had a big impression on me as a young child. And then when I was in college, the TV show Boston Public came on. It was a TV show built on this public school in Boston, dealt with all the teachers and the principals and administrators, and I was inspired. And I wanted to be a high school history teacher. I learned while doing my student teaching that I didn't quite have the maturity to be able to deal with kids. The kids were doing things where I needed to discipline them, and it was funny. So I realized that wouldn't be something that I would go into. But education is still really, really important to me. So today's episode, we'll be talking to Dr. Cameron J. Harris about higher learning. What is higher? What is learning? What is higher learning? If you don't get that reference, watch a black movie. Okay? Watch some black movies. Not on Tubi, though, but watch some black movies. So we'll be talking about higher education. And I know college for me was a big deal because it literally helped me grow as a person. You are entering in a world where there are a bunch of people who are different than you and come from different backgrounds. Contrary to what people believe, when you're from a certain area and you go to high school, no matter if you're different races, religions, or creeds, you're all pretty much from the same area. Your thought processes and your ideology may change a little bit unless you're in an extremely diverse area, but pretty much you're all pretty similar because it's your environment that you're coming from. You can recognize certain things that are, I know this about this person, I know that about that person. We're not so dissimilar. But in college, we have people coming from all over the world, introducing you to new ideologies, new religions, new ethnicities, right? If you're really into learning about people, and that's my main thing, I love learning about people, then you can really grow in college. And I did. I transformed. My evolution truly began when I entered in college, and it grew me as a person. And now in America, higher education is kind of a demand. I have a friend of mine. She's retired now. I think she's about 65 years old. She retired about 5 or 6 years ago. But she worked in Navy housing. And she actually graduated from high school and immediately went working in the Navy housing. And I don't know if a lot of you people know about these GS classifications, but she got the GS-13, making over 6 figures a year. It was a different time, right? Making over 6 figures a year with just a high school education. She would often tell me that everybody that she was hiring to be co-workers with her in order to do her job, the requirement was you had to have a college education. you gotta have a college education in order to enter the workforce and progress to the point where you can actually make a livable wage. The only problem is that unless you're extremely intelligent and you get scholarships, you're going into debt. So you're entering adulthood into debt, but you've got no choice because the only way to really make money, unless you're really inventive, this new younger generation are coming up with ways just with technology to become millionaires and billionaires, right? So, but they have a talent and they exploit that talent, right? Not everybody has that type of talent. Some people have to enter in the workforce. And if you're entering in the workforce, you gotta go to college. It's a prerequisite now for anything, any major job. So this series in education in America is going to be really talking about how important education is from K through 12 into higher learning. We're starting with higher learning because I want to work my way down. I want to start with college and then work it all the way down to college professor. So we're going to be having a bunch of different people coming in that I'm going to be interviewing, talking about education because it's important. And also, nobody wants to be stupid. But there's a difference between education and intelligence, right? Like, I know a lot of people who are highly educated who are dumb as hell. I know a lot of people who are intelligent that don't have a lot of education. Education doesn't automatically equate to intelligence, but what education and specifically college can do is prepare you for the work world. So today's episode, I'll be interviewing Dr. Cameron J. Harris, and we'll be talking about higher education, and it's going to be really interesting, some of the things that he has to say, and I hope you enjoy it. And then at the end, I'm going to tell you the story about the time that a college course made me cry. It's not embarrassing, but it is. Okay, I'm here with Dr. Cameron J. Harris, a professor of business at George Mason University. I want to thank you for joining me today. How you doing?
Pretty good.
I know I got you up a little bit early on the weekend, but I appreciate you joining.
A pleasure to be here.
All right, that's what I like to hear. So let's start from the beginning. Can you give me a little bit about your background?
Yes. So I arrived in higher education as an undergraduate student and really, I think, took advantage of the experiences that I had as a student. And that really led me to want to sort of stay in college. And so I left for a little while and came back. So I sort of arrived at a passion for teaching. And that is what got me back. I actually did my undergrad at George Mason, and I'm now back as a professor. I teach in the School of Business, but my background is actually in higher education. And so it's sometimes misleading when people are like, oh, you're a business professor, and I am, but I sort of teach the things that fall sort of through the cracks of business and thinking about professional skills, things like emotional intelligence, business communication, those things that sometimes we expect for students to get or know, but we know that that doesn't always happen. And so it's interesting being in a school of business as someone with a higher education and student affairs background. But yes, that's sort of how I arrived in a school of business in higher education, is that I really just had a passion and interest and started to learn about it through my own education. And now I'm on the other side.
Okay, script, because you opened up something that I didn't even think of. When you're talking about teaching life skills, we know that we're in different generations, right? There's the boomers, the Generation X, the millennials, and Gen Zers. As you're progressing along, because you've been professor for how long now? How many years?
Full time. This is year 9. Yeah,
9. So I guess that would be in between millennials and Gen Z.
Yeah.
But your student body is diverse as far as the age dynamic, correct? So you may have millennials and Gen Z, and maybe even some Gen Xers in your student body. Do you notice any difference between the generations and life skills?
Absolutely. Partly because many students, I'm thinking about the backgrounds of students. So some of them will have part-time jobs or full-time jobs. Some of them have multiple full-time jobs. And because they have that sort of experience, they bring a different perspective and background to the classroom. And so when I think about backgrounds of students too, it's like sometimes I have students from other countries who are the traditional 18 to 22-year-old college student, but depending on their culture, some of them have never been involved in a student organization. Some of them have never even thought about what it would be like to work. And so when I'm giving examples in classes and talking about things, they don't have any frame of reference. Like their primary objective in K through 12 was to complete their diploma and to do as good as they could in their classes. And the idea of like outside of class learning is a foreign concept to some people in some cultures. That probably, I think, is the biggest thing.
Isn't it, especially for people from different cultures, but here in the States in K through 12, when you apply for a college, I remember, granted, this was a long time ago when I applied to a college. it was last century, but they asked for your extracurricular things because they wanted well-rounded people. And are you seeing students now? Is that what you're saying? That you're seeing students that are entering in the college atmosphere that are they don't have those type of backgrounds? Are the standards for college admission, have they changed? I know academically, like the University of Maryland has continually increased what you need to achieve to be able to get into that school. But the extracurricular stuff was always a part of it. Is that something that colleges aren't really requiring anymore?
I think it is, but I would say probably one in three of the students that I teach were born in another country, and I think that the idea of sort of the well-roundedness is really more of a Western philosophy, right? Like I think that is something that we have sort of increasingly across higher education in the United States have expected. Like you have the outside of class involvement, and you sort of are a well-rounded student. But I can tell you in other countries that is not a focus point.
Not a focus.
They're not really interested. And so we have so many students who come here from other places. I don't really know how that is impacted in their like admissions process. I imagine that they have less involvement because that is just not as much of a focal point. But they tend to do well, right? Like they're committed to oftentimes committed to good grades, right? So maybe that has something to do with learning. Maybe it doesn't. But I do think that they are definitely different than even I was when I think about my preparation for college. In some ways, a lot more prepared.
You think they're a lot more prepared?
Yeah, I think that they have a lot more access and knowledge about what it will be like. Now, how it actually gets applied is maybe a different story, but I do think that they have more, they know more. They just generally, I think maybe that's internet access and talking to people who have been in their shoes before. And maybe higher education has learned something to like help prepare them. I don't know.
Okay. Well, having such a diverse student body, how do you approach teaching and creating like syllabus for your courses? And how did you adapt to the pandemic? Because obviously that affected everyone.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I learned pretty quickly, especially at a place like Mason, when it is as diverse as it is, you have students from different countries, different ages, work experiences, is to create some options within the assignments, within the examples that you use or that I use in class. And so being mindful that I can have a 50-year-old student who's going back to college to complete a degree program that they started 20 years ago. Or I could have a traditionally aged 18-year-old student who was a high school student 6 months ago in the same class. And that is difficult sometimes to figure out sort of collective path forward. But having options within the curriculum, I think, is important. And so designing with the variety of students that I have in mind is what I've tried to do. But it's for a forever evolving process. It's like you want to have an impact. You want it to be useful. You want it to, reach beyond the four walls of a classroom. But in order to do that, you continuously have to adapt and edit and rethink things. And so it's never done, but I do think that making it as broadly applicable as possible is what I've aimed to do.
Okay.
The pandemic part, patience is the first thing that comes to my mind, and sort of just going with what it is you would want people to give to you, right? I cannot tell you how many times I've had students, and not just with the pandemic, but certainly it increased, where they are taking care of family members or they are sick and not reaching out. And so it took a bit more patience, I think, on my part, but maybe also on theirs. The reality is most university faculty who are not teaching at an online institution, we're not prepared to teach as an online faculty member. And I think there's a lot of focus on students and how they had to transition to an online curriculum and education. But the reality is we had to create that in a lot of ways that were not ideal, right? We had essentially 3 weeks to figure out how to pivot everything to an online platform.
Right. So that leads to an interesting question, because everybody thinks about the students. How did the professors handle that? Because you're right. So you have a certain generation of professors that tenure, so they're probably older, right? And we know the older generation isn't quite as adept in technology as the younger generation is. So I know you're a younger professor, but you work in a department with many professors. What was that process like for the professors to do that quick turnaround? And did some of them just say, you know what, I don't want to do this and walk away from it? How many just stepped up to the challenge and said, hey, this is where we are now. This is what we got to do and get through it. So tell me a little bit about that dynamic behind the scenes for the professors.
Wow. It's wild because it was almost 3 years ago now, but it feels like a lifetime ago. So we had already started the process of building most of our courses within the school as online courses. Now, it didn't mean that everybody was teaching those courses, but I had created the two primary courses that I teach. I had created one in a fully online environment in 2017. Now, because I teach required courses, and so there are 9 of us that teach the same classes. Of course, we sort of make our own mark on them, right? So we have some general things that need to be covered in the course because it is a required course, and so it has to meet some expectations and some outcomes. So we did a lot of sharing. That meant that those people who were not going to, make the most of this or were not as comfortable with it, they could, have some resources. There was a lot of instructional technology support. Almost right away, the university started doing some additional hiring of folks who could essentially, talk to a faculty member, design things, put things up on their course pages. And so a lot of behind the scenes work financially that the university committed to helping faculty learn how to do this. And we definitely had some faculty members who exercise their right to bow out or to retire early. And I think we're still seeing some of that. It's because, when we went back, it wasn't going back in the same way, right? So fall 2020, most of our classes were still online. But I taught face-to-face, and we had to be 6 feet apart. We had to have masks on. There was a way to file into the classroom and file out of the classroom. It was a very different experience than a traditional classroom. And so all the things that you would do, that I would do in a class, to be more like active learning and to move around and to discuss, you couldn't do them.
So those people that bowed out, because I just find it interesting, they just bowed out because I don't want to deal with this. You can't speak for anybody else, so I can't ask you to speak for anybody else. At a certain point, does the love of teaching kind of fade? And you just say, well, I've had it. And this was the last straw for me, and I'm going to go. And is that necessarily a bad thing for both them and the academic community? If they're not fully in, isn't it best for them to go?
I would say yes. And sometimes I think it is maybe taking a break or finding a way to get back to the passion that you have for teaching. Because I will say that it is tiring, of course. I think it's one of the least respected fields, especially in the time and energy and requirements that go into it to do it well. And so I do think over time, we have just sort of not been as appreciative of I would say teachers, and I would say that's probably more on a K through 12 level than it is a higher ed, right? I think most university faculty, I think they have an appreciation that is built into our world, right? I had a point I was coming back to. And I do think that for those who've decided to bow out to that the online thing was too much for them, they were probably always going to be headed in that direction, right? I think we were always going to get to having more courses, more accessibility online. I do think there's a benefit to having as many online classes that we now have as a result of the pandemic. I do think that it has increased access to people who live in remote places, people who started a degree program and didn't finish it, can do so without having to be in Fairfax, Virginia, or in Songdo, South Korea, or wherever our campuses are. And so I think that means something to people that now have access when they didn't have it before. And it will be a learning curve. I mean, it's a learning curve for me, and I'm somebody who is, maybe about double the age of most of the students that I teach. So you got to be committed to continuing the education that you have in order to give the education or to provide the opportunities for education to students.
So that leads me to my next question is, with all that being said, what do you find most rewarding about being a professor?
It might sound silly, but I am connected to many of my former students on LinkedIn. I will see them in random places. A few months ago, I ran into one of my former students in Shirlington, and she was just going out to dinner, and I looked and I said, "Oh, she looks familiar." And so we started talking, and she was telling me about her career and the choices that she was making and how helpful it was, my courses were to her as she, was making her way. And I think I remember she was a student in the upper level course that I taught the first semester that I was teaching at Mason. So that was fall 2015. So she's been out working for probably 5-6 years now.
Right.
And so hearing their success stories and knowing that maybe I had something a little bit to do with their success, I think is probably the most meaningful. Yeah.
That's good. That's the way it should be. I believe that teachers are the future. Lead them well and let them lead the way. So you talked about running into your former students, and that leads me to my next question. How do you engage with your students outside of the classroom? Not necessarily run into them, after they've graduated, but just outside of teaching. How do you engage with your students?
So one of the ways, almost immediately when I started in this position, I, of course, am at the same institution where I was an undergraduate student. And so I was interested in the things that I was involved in and had a passion for and how they were going. So I almost immediately became advisor to the Black Student Alliance on campus. Okay. And actually an event that I started when I was a student was still happening. And so, yeah. Very full circle. And so when I learned that it was still happening, I was like shocked. I mean, a little shocked, but also like, of course, I felt good about it. And so I started talking to the students who were in the leadership of the organization. And so then I eventually became their advisor. And so that is the primary way, is advising student organizations that I interact with students. And it is a very different way of engaging with students. When I'm in a classroom, I think students are much more formal in the way that they address me and the things that they will talk about me or talk with me about. But as an advisor, many of these students I don't have in class, the types of conversations, the way that they, approach me is very different. It does feel obviously less formal, but it feels more genuine, right? Like I'm not really being paid to be there. And so I feel like it sort of allows me to see the actual student experience. And sometimes I step away from it because there are things that I'm like, I don't need to be here for this conversation.
They get a little too comfortable.
I can provide some examples of that as well.
Please
mostly, do. Yes. Okay. So,
first of all, I want to go back to, they're doing an event. They're still doing an event that you created. You're a better person than me, because as soon as I reconnected with that group, I would have told them, hey, I started all this, right? This all because of me.
I essentially did. I was like, I started this. At that point, wow, 12 years ago. Right. So the example, they do what they call a Black freshman orientation. And they do these like breakout rooms where they talk about different topics. So these are incoming students. They can be first year students. They can be transfer students. But they talk about what it is like to be a student at Mason. Mm-hmm. And so I go to the event as an advisor. They have, and this is right at the beginning of the fall semester. And so these are new students that have just moved in. And so I peek my head in the door to ask to just see how the conversations are going. So they have a panel of current students, and then they have the new students who are asking questions. So the breakout rooms were about all sorts of different things. But I remember going into one, and they were talking about the party culture and what the on-campus parties were like. And so at the point that I go into one room and the students are talking about party culture and catching twerks and all of this, I was like, okay, I'm going to step out of this room because I don't need to hear this.
Okay. I know I'm old.
Mm-hmm.
I think I still keep my ear to the street sometimes. I don't know what catching twerks means. What does that even
It's being danced on. Yeah.
oh, okay. Okay. Back in my day, we used to call it freaking, but okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah.
Yes.
Same thing, just a different name. So you say I have to remove myself from this
Yeah.
conversation.
I was like, oh no, I don't. Nope. And that was like, that's the tamer things that I've heard, right? I'm trying to keep it PG here.
We got to keep it PG because it's going to be on YouTube. I'm not trying to get canceled.
Exactly.
Because never mind, I was gonna make they always try and cancel black folks, but I'm not gonna make that joke. Actually, I just did, so it's gonna be on there anyway. Now, we discussed earlier how your student body is very, very diverse, age, race, ethnicity. How do you incorporate diversity and inclusion into your teaching?
It is, I think, in everything. The idea of thinking about the perspectives of students, where they're coming from, and just as important, who they will be when they go out into the world, right? So thinking about how I can create a curriculum, I can think about the range of diversity, identities that they bring to the table, but also thinking about them as change agents for the future. So not just preparing a curriculum that incorporates these things, but also pushes them to be appreciative and recognize diversity, equity, and inclusion in their own lives. And so I think I'm actually doing a project right now. I with two other colleagues and a couple of grad students, are looking at our curriculum and seeing how we can incorporate elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion even more. And so the university is really interested in advancing this content and these ideas, so much so that we have an entire anti-racism and inclusive excellence initiative that is across the university. I'm also a faculty fellow in our Teaching and Learning Center. And so helping other faculty design courses in classrooms that are more representative of the broad range of diversity that we have on campus. And so there's a lot of work to be done because for some faculty, I don't know that they've thought about these issues. But, one of the main reasons that I was attracted to Mason is that when I was looking at colleges as a student, it was the most diverse institution in the nation. I think a second most diverse institution in the nation when I went there. And that was part of the reason why I was attracted to it.
More than the University of Maryland?
Then absolutely. We are, this is an old saying, but most people don't use it anymore, but we are majority minority, right? So we have over 50% of our student body are from underrepresented backgrounds. And I think that is something that you sort of can't be at a place like Mason and not recognize that there's a lot of diversity among the student body, at least, less among the faculty. But
now, as I ask this next question, because we're dealing with a pushback just in the country at large, as far as diversity and inclusion, right? Like there are certain groups of people that feel like there shouldn't be that situation, right? That there shouldn't be diversity and inclusion. Have you had any type of pushback on campus? Obviously, you can't throw your faculty under the bus, but maybe the students that are the minority on campus. They're saying, hey, we're the minority on campus. Why are we catering to the majority? Isn't that countering what it is in America? Mm-hmm. So have you seen any pushback from the student body? Let's keep the faculty out of it. From the student body.
It's interesting because I have not had pushback from students in a few years.
Okay.
I do think that students are sort of leading the charge. Most students are leading the charge in their expectations about DEI from the university. And I don't think that's every student, but I think the ones who would take issue are quiet, probably more so around me than some of their other faculty members, right? So it's interesting what we have access to and what people are sort of uncomfortable to share, or they'll do the thing to complete the assignment even if they don't believe it, right? They will say, and I recognize that that's true, but at some point that's going to be in every course, or in a perfect world it's going to be in every course. Having to recognize, appreciate, deal with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's the only way that we're going to sort of help people see the reality of people's lives that are different than theirs. And if we don't incorporate it in all of the places for all of the people to interact with, then we sort of allow the sort of status quo to continue. So I actually think that I probably have heard more from faculty than students. So that's
we don't have to go there if you don't want to. I'm naturally messy. So I want to hear the gossip, but we ain't got to go there. If you don't want to go there, that's fine.
I think that, and I've said this to the leadership of our school, I feel like a school of business should be a place where these concepts and issues are discussed, because they're all business related. And I think that we can be leaders around these topics. I think there's no reason why we couldn't.
Okay. So you talked about really in your creation of your classes to give these people the tools where they evolve what you're teaching to make things better. Where do you see your field in 15 to 20 years as far as the evolution of it? Not only in the school, but out in the world.
I think so many of the shifts of how we do things, it was happening anyway, but I think the pandemic sort of quickened some of them happening. I think how we communicate, how we have expectations of self-care and organizations incorporating elements of DEI, the ideas about work-life balance. I think all of those are things that the incoming generation and culture are shifting. And so that is where I think we'll see the most change, is that there will be an expectation, or there already is an expectation, that organizations are in some ways more caring about their employees. And I think this generation is driving that. And I think that those are the biggest shifts that we will see, is that there is an expectation that the organizations will be more thoughtful about how they approach work-life balance, and when people are available and not available. And so it's interesting that I think our culture is moving in that direction. And so that is going to impact business. It's going to impact expectations about the workplace, how available and accessible you are. And so that's where I think we will see the biggest shifts.
Now, do you think that's the companies that are awakening, or do you think that's the employees saying, no, like, we went through this pandemic, I kind of like work from home and not having to commute an hour, because we're in the DC area. So I kind of like not having to commute an hour to go 10 miles. That's literally what it's like in this area. So do you think it was the companies that are saying, no, we should treat our employees better? Or were the employees saying, no, you're going to treat us better? Or a combination of both?
I think it's a combination. I think about DC and the fact that there are so many empty office buildings. And some people look at that and say, oh, well, that's great because, they don't need the office space. Well, some of that is companies made the decision that if you work from home for 6 months, we could save this money and not have an office that we need to pay for in an expensive city like DC. And it's a win-win, right? You can stay at home, complete the work that we need you to do, and we can save in this office space. And so I think it's a win-win in some cases. What a lot of people aren't talking about is the day-to-day water cooler conversations, the team building, the interactions that happen in a face-to-face environment that don't happen in an online. And so some of that is going to impact the work.
Yeah.
And how that shows up, I think we're just starting to see. And so it'll be interesting to watch.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to take up too much more of your time, but I do have one final question. It's kind of a two-parter.
Okay.
And anything that you want to add outside of this question, by all means, feel free. What advice would you give students that are considering a career in academia? But before that, I know we kind of touched on it. What do you hope your students take away from your classes?
Okay. I hope that they take away that they are prepared to make decisions about their career and their choices of where they're going and what they're doing, to contribute to society in a meaningful way, to think about their work experience as a contribution to society, and to think about having being their own, what I like to say is their own best self advocate, right? You have to be mindful of the experiences and the talents and treasures that you bring to wherever you're going, and that you have some say in it. I think for many of my students who are first generation, they enter the job market needing a job.
Right.
Well, these organizations need an employee. And so you have a choice in that I don't think I remind them that they have a choice in, right? Like, just as you need a job, they also need to hire someone. And so thinking about making a choice, being focused and understanding that you have some opportunity, but you have to be the driver of that. And so I'm all about them taking initiative in making choices that align with who they are. For some people, that means financial success. For some people, that means being able to travel. For some people, that means higher education and being able to access it. And so for every one of them, I recognize that they will get a little something different from the course, and that's okay too.
And then for people that want to be like you,
Okay.
they want to be like Dr. Harris.
I would say, as much advice as I could give, the higher education landscape is forever changing. And so I can remember being, when I was entering higher ed, and people had lots of opinions and thoughts about what I should be doing and the types of jobs I would be prepared for. And this sort of just happened the way it was supposed to happen. I was being prepared for an already changing higher education world. And so some of the advice that I received was old when it was given to me, and it was not as helpful as it could have been. And so I recognize that is going to continue to be true, is that it is a changing field. I think about how in academia, how we think about the impact of research, for example. So much of that is based on the number of times you are being cited in the writing that you're doing, but also in social media. That is an expectation of some professors' work in process. And that is not a conversation we could have had even 10 years ago. And so it will forever be changing. And it is, again, similar to the advice that I would give to students. You have to be your own best advocate, because the people who are teaching you these classes are already halfway out the door, right? Like, it's true. And I'm one of those people, so I get it. You are going to have more success and more access than I did, and that should be the case.
Right. Well, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so.
I want to thank you once again, thanking Dr. Cameron J. Harris, Professor of Business at George Mason University, for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Once again, I want to thank Dr. Cameron J. Harris for that interview. I think that was really insightful, and I hope people out here learned something from it. More specifically, the toll the pandemic took on the professors. And now that's a new theme that I'll be looking into, which each interview is, we talked about the students, but what about the professors and the teachers? So that's interesting. I think so. But let's get to the story. The time a college course made me cry. So I feel like I have above average intelligence. I'm smarter than most, but not as smart as some. And I never really had any challenges in high school and for the first couple of years in college. Like, there weren't too many courses that challenged me. There was one course my freshman year, I took physics. I got an A. I still don't know how I got an A. My uncle, God rest his soul, was like, hey man, you really should look into, doing something with physics. You got an A in physics? That's really impressive. I was like, Uncle Kenny, I don't know how I got that A. I got it. I don't know how I got it. I had to give a presentation, and I guess I BS my way into an A. Whatever. But that's not the course. So my junior year, you start to get into your courses for your college. And like I said earlier, I'm studying to be a high school history teacher. So I was a double major, right? So secondary education and history. But for some strange reason, one of the required courses was an economic course. And not economic 100. It was something like economics 200 or something like that. I hadn't even taken the 100 level course yet. But I'm figuring economics is kind of like math, and I'm really good at math, so it won't be a problem. Let me tell you where the first problem began, or when I realized that this class was going to be an issue. The first day of the class, the professor said, yeah, and this class will be graded on a curve. That's never a good thing. When a class is graded on a curve, that means nobody in there is getting above an 80%. Everybody in there is technically failing, but since everybody is failing, they're graded on a curve so that the people that are failing that much actually passes the class with an A. But I'm thinking, hey, this won't be that hard, because me and my lazy self would always go through the first day, look at the syllabus, and go through each assignment and say, I can half-ass this, I can take it easy on that, I really need to put in all the effort on this. Why? Because I'm lazy, right? And my intelligence, my above average intelligence, has got me by, skated me by. I'm at the University of Maryland, right? I got there for academics. So obviously, the things that I've done to get to this point have worked. So why wouldn't it work for economics? First test, I do my usual BS bull studying. Everybody fails this test, but it's graded on a curve. But I still legitimately failed this test. I mean, I got like a 20%. Now, the highest score in the class was like 60%. But because I got a 20%, I still failed this class. I failed this test. The very first test, my junior year of college, that I had ever failed. Nothing had ever gotten close to that. The lowest grade I had ever gotten up to that point on any assignment. I'm not talking about a final grade. The lowest final grade I had gotten to that point was a B. The lowest grade I'd gotten on any assignment was a C. And here I am legitimately failing this test, and there's only 4 tests in a year. Oh, I forgot to mention this point. There's 4 tests in a year, but they allow you to drop one of your lowest tests. So only 3 of those 4 count. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I can't BS this class. This is obviously the test I'm going to drop. Can't get any lower than this. I actually got to study. Here we go, getting up for test number 2. And if I remember correctly, there were no midterms. There were no finals. It was just 4 tests. Test number 2, I actually studied for it. I mean, like for real studying. This myth of college and all-nighters, anybody who pulled an all-nighter, you must not have been paying attention at all during the entire semester. You were trying to cram everything into one night. That's ridiculous. I would do a crash course of 3 or 4 days, studying multiple hours in a day to really break it down. And I thought I had it. Listen to the words I said. I thought I had it. I go in there, I'm confident. I am confident. Take that test, finish the test. I'm confident as I finish the test. Week later, I get the test back. 20%. That's right. Same exact score. But this time I actually tried. The very first time that I ever tried, really tried, anything that was educated related, and failed. I'm 20 years old. I walk back to my dorm room. It's a long walk. Anybody that knows the University of Maryland, the class was at the top of the mall. So it was at a building at the top of the mall. Then I got to walk all the way down to the mall, cross Route 1, because I lived in New Leonardtown Apartments, right behind Frat Row. So I've got to go through the mall, all the frats, and I feel it inside of me bubbling up because this is the first time I failed at anything. And I get into my dorm room, and luckily I had a single at that point. I get into my dorm room, I put the paper on the desk, I put my hands in my head, and I sob. And not just a few tears rolling down. I'm sobbing. I'm trying to muffle the sound so nobody can hear me sobbing because I'm crying. I am heartbroken because I actually studied. There's snot going everywhere. I'm crying. I go through that good 10 to 15 minutes. Never told anybody this. No, I've told a few people this story. Go through that 10 to 15 minutes. I sit down in a chair. I'm legitimately I don't know what I'm going to do. I have to pass this class in order to be a teacher. I got 20%. I've got to get some of the highest scores in the next 2 tests to just pass the class. I just need to get a C. That's all I need to get. Never shot for a C before in my life, but I'm shooting for a C. Long story short, I got the C. I passed the class. But that was the first time ever in my life that a class made me cry. And it was a for real cry. But on that note, I'm going to end today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The very first video podcast. That's right. We're on YouTube and Twitch. You can find us at unsolicited_perspectives at both YouTube and Twitch. We'll be doing live shows every Thursday night at 7:30. That's the happy hour with my sis. It's a late happy hour, but it'll still be a happy hour with my sis. Until next time, I'm going to holler.
Thank you for listening to Unsolicited Perspectives with Bruce Anthony. Please subscribe, like, comment, share, and donate. Donations help us keep giving you this free content each and every week. Until next time, Howdy 5000. Peace.
Freedom over fame. Freedom over fame. The cycle stays the same. Freedom over fame.